Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the heroes are flawed, the villains are charming, and the line between love and hate is as thin and sharp as a Bowie knife. Pull up a stool and pour a drink, because tonight's story is about a man who was as fast with a gun as he was with his heart. It's the tale of a gunslinger's final promise, and how it was shattered by the very woman who inspired it. This is the story of Jack Ironhand Callahan. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the dusty streets of Abilene in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. For most folks, it was the end of another grueling day. For Jack Ironhand Callahan, it was the end of a life. He stood in the long shadows of the livery stable, the metallic scent of recently fired gunpowder still clinging to the air like a cheap perfume. A few feet away, two men lay still in the dirt, their careers as wannabe legends cut brutally short. They'd thought the name Ironhand was just a story. They'd learned, in their final moments, that legends often have a foundation of cold, hard fact. Jack wasn't a big man, nor was he flashy. He was built of lean muscle and quiet intensity. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, carved by sun and wind, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that missed nothing. His moniker, Ironhand, didn't come from a prosthetic, but from the nerving stillness of his gun hand. In a world of twitchy fingers and nervous energy, Jack's hand was a rock, an extension of his unwavering will. When his cold peacemaker cleared leather, it was with an economy of motion that was both beautiful and terrifying to behold. He hadn't drawn first today. He never did. But he always fired last. He felt nothing as he looked at the bodies. Not pride, not remorse. Just a hollow, bone-deep weariness that had been his constant companion for more years than he cared to count. The life of a gunslinger was a life of ghosts of the men you'd killed, and the ghost of the man you might have been. Jack was tired of living with ghosts. He holstered his Colt, the worn leather sighing in protest, and turned his back on the scene. Sheriff Miller would be along soon. He and Jack had an understanding. Jack only ever cleaned up messes. He never started them. The town paid him a handsome fee, and he moved on. It was a clean, bloody, and soul-crushingly lonely existence. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't moving on alone. He walked down the main street, his boot heels kicking up little puffs of dust that danced in the dying light. He ignored the curtain-twitching townspeople and the fearful glances. His focus was on the small boarding house at the end of the street, and the warm, golden light spilling from a second-story window. That light was the only sun he cared about anymore. That light was Mary Lou. He had met her 6 months ago in a dusty town in the Arizona Territory. He'd been recovering from a bullet wound to his side, and she had been the doctor's niece, a woman with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as green and deep as a summer forest. She had tended to his wound with a gentleness he hadn't known existed. She had looked at him not as Ironhand the killer, but as Jack the man. She had seen the weariness in his soul and had not flinched. For the first time in his life, Jack Callahan had fallen in love. It was a feeling so powerful, so all-encompassing, it terrified him more than any gunfight ever could. Love was a vulnerability, a weakness. In his world, weaknesses got you killed. But with Mary Lou, it felt like the only strength that mattered. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart, for once, beating faster than it did in a duel. He opened the door to their room, and the scent of lavender and fresh bread washed over him, chasing away the smell of gunpowder. Mary Lou was sitting by the window, humming a soft tune. She looked up as he entered, and a smile that could melt the winter snow spread across her face. "Jack," she said, her voice a soft melody. "You're back." She rose and came to him, her hands gently touching his face. Her fingers traced the lines of weariness around his eyes. "It's over?" she asked, a hint of fear in her voice. "It's over," he confirmed. He took her hands in his rough, callous fingers enveloping her delicate ones. "All of it." She looked at him, her green eyes searching his. "What do you mean, Jack?" He led her to the small wooden table and sat her down. He knelt before her, a position of supplication that felt more natural than any standoff he'd ever been in. "I mean the guns, Mary Lou. The running. The killing. I'm done. That was the last time." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch, heavy with coins, and a deed to a small piece of land in the Montana valleys. It was a place with rolling green hills, a clear running stream, and a sky so big it could hold all the dreams a man could ever have. I've been saving, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. For this. For us. Orange. A place where the only thing I'll raise is cattle, and the only thing I aim for is a peaceful old age with you. Tears welled in Mary Lou's eyes, shimmering like emeralds in the lamplight. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "Oh, Jack," she sobbed. "Are you sure? Can you really leave it all behind?" He held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Leaving it is the easiest thing in the world," he whispered. "It's staying that's been the hard part. You make me want to stay." He pulled back and looked her in the eye, his gaze intense and wavering. This was more than a plan, it was a vow, a sacred oath sworn in the church of his heart. "I promise you, Mary Lou," he said, his voice a low, solemn rumble. "From this day forward, my gun is retired. I'll never draw on another man again. I'll be the man you deserve. This is my last promise." She kissed him then, a kiss filled with tears and hope and the promise of a new dawn. And in that moment, holding her in his arms, Jack Iron Hand Callahan felt a sense of peace he had never known. The ghosts were silent. The weariness was gone. He had a future, a life, a love that was worth more than all the gold in the territories. He had made his last promise, and he would die before he broke it. He just never imagined that the person who would force him to break it would be the very woman to whom he had sworn his soul. The next 2 weeks were the closest to heaven Jack had ever known. The weight of his past seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by the lighter, more pleasant burden of planning a future. He and Mary Lou spent their days poring over maps of their land in Montana, debating the best spot for the house, the number of cattle to buy, the names of their future children. It was a life he had only ever dreamed of in the lonely hours before a gunfight, a fantasy he'd never truly believed could be his. Mary Lou was the heart of it all. She was filled with an infectious excitement, her laughter a constant, joyful sound in their small room. She sketched drawings of their future home, her brow furrowed in concentration, her tongue peeking out from the corner of her lips. She was the architect of his salvation, and he worshipped her with a quiet, reverent devotion. They were due to leave for Montana on the morning stagecoach in 3 days. Jack had already purchased the tickets and sent a wire ahead to have supplies waiting for them. He had sold his spare horses, keeping only his trusted stallion, Diablo. He had even packed away his gun belt, placing the cold peacemaker at the bottom of his saddlebag, a retired king abdicating his bloody throne. It was during these final days that the first, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the perfect glass of his new reality. It was a small thing, a brief, discordant note in the beautiful symphony of their love. A man had come to town, a slick-looking fellow in a city suit who called himself a land agent. He had been asking questions around town about Jack, about his plans. Jack had paid him no mind. His reputation was a magnet for the curious. But one afternoon, he saw the agent speaking to Mary Lou in the street. Their conversation was brief, and from a distance, it looked innocent enough. But when Mary Lou returned to their room, there was a shadow in her eyes, a flicker of something that looked like fear. "Who was that man?" Jack asked, his tone casual, belying the sudden, sharp prickle of unease at the back of his neck. "Oh, no one," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Just a man asking for directions to the assayer's office. He was lost." She busied herself with folding clothes, her back to him. Jack didn't press the issue. To doubt her felt like a betrayal, a sacrilege. He told himself it was just the old instincts of a life he was leaving behind, the paranoia of a man who had survived by trusting no one. He had to learn to trust her, to trust this new life. But the whisper of doubt, once planted, had taken root. The next day, a more significant crack appeared. Jack was at the general store, stocking up on provisions for their journey, when he overheard a name that made the blood in his veins run cold: Silas Kane. Kane was a ghost from Jack's past, but not one of the men he had killed. He was worse. Kane was a rival, a man who ran a ruthless gang of outlaws that specialized in extortion and ambush. He was a snake, a man who preferred to strike from the shadows. Years ago, Jack had dismantled one of Kane's operations, a move that had cost Kane a fortune and had earned Jack a permanent place at the top of the man's enemy list. Kane wasn't the type to forgive or forget. Two prospectors were talking in low, hushed tones. "Heard Silas Kane's crew has been spotted up near the Cimarron," one said. "Riding hard. Looks like they're heading this way." What would Kane want in Abilene? The other asked. Same thing he wants everywhere, the first replied with a grim chuckle. Trouble. Jack felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his gut. The timing was too coincidental. Kane, showing up now, just as Jack was about to disappear. He tried to dismiss it as bad luck, a final, cruel twist of fate. But the whisper of doubt was growing louder. He returned to the room to find Mary Lou packing a small, separate valise. What's that for? He asked. She jumped, startled by his sudden appearance. Oh, just some of my more delicate things. I thought it would be safer to keep them with me on the stagecoach. Her smile seemed strained, her eyes avoiding his. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay beside Mary Lou, listening to the soft, even rhythm of her breathing. She was the picture of innocence, of peace. But the cracks in the glass were spreading, and he could no longer ignore them. The land agent. The mention of Silas Kane. Mary Lou's strange, nervous behavior. It was a constellation of unsettling facts, and his mind, honed by years of survival, was beginning to draw the lines between them. He rose from the bed, his movements silent, and went to the window. The moon was a silver sliver in a black, star-dusted sky. He looked down at the silent street, his mind a whirlwind of suspicion and a desperate, heartbreaking hope that he was wrong. His gaze fell upon the alleyway across the street. A figure was standing in the shadows, a man smoking a cheroot, the glowing red tip a malevolent eye in the darkness. As Jack watched, the man looked up, his gaze fixing directly on their window. He brought the cheroot to his lips, and in the brief, bright flare of its tip, Jack saw his face. It was the land agent. The man held his gaze for a long, challenging moment, then dropped the cheroot, crushed it under his heel, and melted back into the shadows. The whisper of doubt was now a deafening roar. The man wasn't a land agent. He was a watchman. He was one of Kane's men. And he was watching them. He was watching Mary Lou. Jack turned from the window, his heart a cold, heavy lump of lead in his chest. He looked at the woman sleeping in their bed, the woman who was the center of his universe, the woman for whom he had promised to lay down his guns. And for the first time, a question, a terrible, blasphemous question, formed in his mind. Who was she, really? The promise he had made was one of peace, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that a war was coming. And the enemy, the traitor, might not be outside the door, but sleeping peacefully in his own bed. The foundation of his new life was built on a lie, and the whole, beautiful structure was about to come crashing down. The final day before their scheduled departure dawned with a cruel, mocking brightness. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air held the crisp, clean promise of a new beginning. But for Jack, the world had been plunged into a cold, gray twilight of suspicion. The image of Kane's men watching their window was burned into his mind, a constant, searing reminder that his dream was built on a foundation of sand. He said nothing to Mary Lou. He couldn't. To voice his suspicions would be to make them real, to give life to the monstrous doubt that was eating him alive. He watched her as she moved about the room, her movements full of a nervous, brittle energy. She was still smiling, still talking about Montana, but her eyes were haunted, her laughter thin and fragile. She was playing a part, and he, the man who was supposed to be her partner for life, was now her unwilling audience. He knew he couldn't leave, not like this. He couldn't step onto that stagecoach with this poison in his heart. He had to know the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how devastating. The gunslinger in him, the man he had tried to bury, was stirring, his instincts screaming that a trap was being laid. He told Mary Lou he was going to the stables to make the final arrangements for Diablo. It was a plausible excuse, a way to get out of the suffocating confines of their room. As he left, he saw the look of relief that flashed across her face, a look so brief, so fleeting, that he might have missed it if he hadn't been looking for it. It was another small cut, another twist of the knife that was already embedded in his heart. He didn't go to the stables. Instead, he found a position across the street, in the shadowy doorway of the blacksmith's forge, and he waited. He was a patient man. He had once waited for 3 days in a freezing mountain pass for a target. Waiting for the woman he loved to betray him was an agony of a different sort, but the principle was the same. He didn't have to wait long. Less than 10 minutes after he had left, the door to the boarding house opened and Mary Lou emerged. She was wearing a traveling cloak, its hood pulled up to obscure her face. She looked up and down the street, her movements furtive, and then she scurried across the road, disappearing into the very alleyway where Jack had seen Kane's man the night before. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air rushed from his lungs, leaving him gasping, hollowed out. This was it. The final, irrefutable proof. The whisper of doubt was now a confession. He followed her, his steps the silent, predatory tread of a man who had made a living from stalking his prey. He reached the mouth of the alley and peered around the corner. Mary Lou was there, her back to him. And she was not alone. She was talking to the man from the night before, the land agent. Their voices were low, urgent whispers, but in the close confines of the alley, Jack could hear every word. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the last, fragile remnants of his heart. "Is he gone?" the man asked, his voice a low growl. "Yes," Mary Lou replied, her voice trembling. "He's at the stables. But he's getting suspicious. I can feel it. We have to do this tonight." "Kane's not going to like the change of plan," the man said. He wanted Callahan taken on the trail, quiet-like. "There's no time," she insisted, her voice rising with a note of hysteria. "He's not the fool you think he is. If we wait, he'll figure it out. It has to be tonight. At the saloon. He's meeting the sheriff for a farewell drink. He'll be relaxed. His guard will be down. It's the only way." "And the promise," the man sneered. "The great Jack Callahan has sworn off his guns. You sure he won't be wearing his peacemaker?" A cold, terrible silence hung in the air for a moment. And then, Mary Lou spoke the words that would damn her forever in Jack's soul. "He packed it away," she said, her voice a dead, emotionless monotone. "He packed it away for me." The man chuckled, a low, cruel sound. "Perfect. Kane will be pleased. You get him to that saloon, darling. We'll take care of the rest. And you'll get what was promised to you." He reached out and handed her a small, heavy pouch of coins. She took it, her hand trembling. She turned, and for a heart-stopping moment, her eyes met Jack's. There was no recognition in them, no love, no remorse. Only the cold, hard glint of a stranger, a woman he had never known. The mask had been removed, and the face beneath was that of a Judas. She hurried away, clutching her 30 pieces of silver, leaving Jack alone in the alley, the world having crumbled to dust around him. He didn't move. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by a pain so profound, so absolute. It was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest that made it impossible to breathe. Every memory of the past 6 months, every smile, every kiss, every whispered promise, was now a lie, a carefully crafted piece of a monstrous, soul-destroying deception. She hadn't loved him. She had been a tool, a honey trap sent by his oldest enemy to lure him to his death. The dream of a ranch, of a peaceful life, of a family, it had all been a mirage, a cruel joke played on a weary, love-starved fool. The gunslinger, the man he had tried so hard to kill, rose from the ashes of his broken heart, cold, hard, and filled with a righteous, terrifying fury. The weariness was gone, burned away by the white-hot fire of betrayal. The hollow space in his chest where his heart had been was now filled with a single, all-consuming purpose: vengeance. He had made a promise to Mary Lou, a promise to lay down his guns forever. And she had used that promise to sign his death warrant. He would still keep his promise, in a way. He would not be the man he was. He would be something new, something colder, something harder. He was no longer Jack Callahan, the man who dreamed of a quiet life. He was Iron Hand, the legend, the reaper of men. And he was about to break his last promise. He was going back to his room, and he was strapping on his gun. There was going to be a meeting at the saloon tonight, just as she had planned. But the man who was coming to that meeting was not the man she was expecting. He was coming for a reckoning. The clock on the wall of the boarding house room ticked with a slow, merciless rhythm, each tick a countdown to the final act of a tragedy. Jack sat on the edge of the bed where he had dreamed of a future with Mary Lou, and methodically cleaned his cold peacemaker. The familiar ritual, the smell of gun oil and steel, was a cold comfort, an anchor in the storm of his emotions. The man who had packed this gun away was dead. The man who now held it was a ghost, an instrument of a justice that was as personal and as brutal as a knife in the dark. Mary Lou returned a few minutes later, her face a carefully constructed mask of innocence. She held up a new dress, a beautiful thing of dark green silk that matched her eyes. "Do you like it, Jack?" she asked, her voice a flawless imitation of the woman he had thought he loved. "I thought I would wear it tonight, for our last night in Abilene." Jack looked up from his work, his eyes as cold and as gray as a winter sky. He said nothing. He just held her gaze, letting the silence stretch, letting her see the new, hard light in his eyes. The mask began to slip. A flicker of fear, of uncertainty, crossed her face. "Jack, what is it? What's wrong?" "I know, Mary Lou," he said, his voice a low, dead thing, devoid of the warmth and the love that had once filled it. The color drained from her face. The dress slipped from her fingers, pooling on the floor like a puddle of dark, stagnant water. "No," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Know what?" "I know about Cain," he said, each word a carefully aimed bullet. "I know about the alley. I know about the saloon." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon her. "I know about the promise." She collapsed onto a chair, all pretense, all artifice, gone. She was no longer the innocent angel of his dreams, but a cornered, terrified woman, her face a canvas of guilt and fear. "Jack, I can explain," she pleaded, her voice a desperate, pathetic whimper. "Can you?" he asked, the question laced with a cold, cruel irony. "Can you explain why the woman I was willing to change my life for, the woman I trusted with my very soul, would sell me to my oldest enemy for a handful of coins?" He stood up, the gun belt now in his hands. He strapped it around his waist, the familiar weight a grim, reassuring presence. It felt like coming home. "He made me do it, Jack," she cried, the tears now flowing freely, though they held no power over him anymore. "Cain, he has my brother. He said he would kill him if I didn't help him. I had no choice." The story had the ring of a desperate, last-minute fabrication. But even if it were true, it didn't matter. She had made her choice. She had chosen her brother over him. She had chosen to sacrifice him to save her own blood. In the brutal and forgiving calculus of the West, it was an understandable choice. But it was not one he could forgive. "A choice is a choice, Mary Lou," he said, his voice as hard as the steel of the gun on his hip. "You chose. Now, I have to choose." He walked to the door, his hand on the knob. "What are you going to do?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. He turned and looked at her one last time, at the beautiful face that had been his heaven and was now his hell. "You told your friend that I would be at the saloon tonight," he said, his voice a low, menacing promise. "You told him my guard would be down, that I would be unarmed." He patted the butt of his Colt. "I'm a man of my word, Mary Lou. I'll be there, but I'll be coming to collect on a debt. And Silas Cain is about to find out that the price of betrayal is paid in blood." He left her there, her sobs the only sound in the room, and walked down the stairs and out into the gathering dusk. The world was sharper now, the colors more vivid, the sounds more distinct. The rage had burned away the fog of love, leaving behind a cold, clear, and terrifying purpose. The saloon was crowded, the air thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, stale cigar smoke, and unwashed bodies. Jack pushed through the swinging doors, and a sudden, electric silence fell over the room. The laughter died, the piano player's hands froze over the keys. Every eye in the room turned to him. They knew who he was. They saw the gun on his hip, the look in his eyes, and they knew that the legend of Iron Hand was not yet over. He saw them immediately. Cain's men. There were 4 of them, spread out through the room, trying to look casual, but their hands were too close to their guns, their eyes too watchful. They were amateurs. He ignored them, his gaze fixed on the man standing at the far end of the bar. Silas Cain. He was a tall, handsome man, with a cruel, thin-lipped smile and eyes as black and as lifeless as a shark's. He was holding a glass of whiskey, and he raised it in a mock toast to Jack. "Callahan," he said, his voice a smooth, confident purr. "I was hoping I'd see you tonight. I heard you were retiring. A shame. The West will be a duller place without you." "I put my retirement on hold," Jack said, his voice a low growl that carried across the silent room. "I had some unfinished business to attend to." He began to walk towards Cain, his steps slow, deliberate, each one a drumbeat of impending doom. Cain's men began to shift, to move their hands towards their guns. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Jack said, his voice never rising, his eyes never leaving Cain's. But one of them, a young, foolish kid with more bravado than sense, decided to test the legend. His hand moved, a blur of motion towards the gun on his hip. He never cleared leather. Jack's hand was a flash of impossible speed. The cold peacemaker seemed to leap into his hand, a single, deafening roar echoing through the saloon. The young man was thrown backwards, a neat, black hole in the center of his forehead, his face a mask of stunned surprise. The saloon erupted into chaos. The other three men drew their guns, their shots wild, splintering the bar, shattering bottles, sending the terrified patrons diving for cover. But Jack was no longer there. He was a ghost, a blur of motion, moving through the chaos with a deadly, practiced grace. Two more shots, so close together they sounded like one. Two more of Kane's men fell, clutching at their chests, their lives ending in a gurgle of blood and whiskey. Now, there was only one left, the land agent, the man from the alley. He was using a flipped-over card table as cover, his hand shaking as he tried to reload his pistol. Jack walked towards him, the smoke from his Colt curling around him like a shroud. He kicked the table aside, sending the man sprawling. He stood over him, the barrel of his gun pointed at the man's terrified face. "Where is he?" Jack demanded, his voice a low, menacing hiss. The man didn't answer. He just stared at the gun, his eyes wide with the certainty of his own death. Jack didn't ask again. He fired. The saloon was silent again, the only sound the frantic, ragged breathing of the terrified patrons. Jack stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies, the smoke from his gun the only thing that moved. And then, he looked at the end of the bar. Silas Kane was gone. The snake had slipped away in the chaos. Jack felt a new, colder wave of fury wash over him. This was not over. This was just the beginning. He had broken his promise. He had tasted the bitter fruit of vengeance, and it had not sated his hunger. It had only made it stronger. He walked out of the saloon, leaving behind a scene of carnage and a legend reborn in blood. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man hunting it down. And he would not stop until he had found Silas Kane, and the woman who had sent him on this dark, bloody path. The chase was on. The trail of Silas Kane was a trail of ghosts. Not the specters of the men Jack had killed had learned long ago to silence those voices, but the ghosts of the life he had almost had. Kane was clever, always staying one step ahead, but he was also arrogant. He left a trail of chaos in his wake, a series of taunts designed to mock Jack, to draw him further into the unforgiving wilderness of the territories, and further away from the man he had tried to become. Jack rode Diablo hard, the powerful stallion eating up the miles with a relentless, ground-covering pace. He was a man possessed, fueled by a cold, burning rage and a steady diet of black coffee and bitter regret. He pushed himself and his horse to the limits of their endurance, the need for vengeance a physical, gnawing hunger in his gut. His first stop was a small, dusty outpost called Purgatory Flats, a fitting name for the state of his soul. He found what was left of a stagecoach, its sides riddled with bullet holes, its passengers robbed and left for dead. A survivor, a shaken traveling salesman, told Jack a story of a smooth-talking man with cold black eyes and a beautiful woman with hair the color of spun gold. They had taken everything of value and had ridden off, laughing. Mary Lou. The knowledge that she was an active participant in Kane's crimes, not just a coerced accomplice, was another turn of the knife. The image of her laughing as she rode away from the scene of a brutal robbery was a poison that seeped into the last and corrupted corners of his memory. Every tender moment they had shared was now suspect, every shared smile a lie. He tracked them north, into the high, rugged country of the Rockies. The pursuit became a grim, relentless routine. He would ride until Diablo was near collapse, then make a cold camp, sleeping with his hand on his gun, his dreams filled with the ghost of a green-eyed woman who was now his sworn enemy. In a town called Redemption, a name that dripped with a cruel, mocking irony, found another piece of the puzzle. He spoke to an old prospector, a man with eyes that had seen too much, who had been a part of a poker game with some of Kane's men. They were bragging, the old man said, fitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Bragging about their new prize, the Gunslinger's girl. Said she was as cold-blooded as any of them. Said she'd helped them plan the ambush of a payroll wagon up near Cripple Creek. The old man looked at Jack, his eyes shrewd. "You look like a man with a heavy heart, mister. You ain't the law, are you?" "No," Jack said, his voice a low, gravelly thing. "I'm the reckoning." He left the old man and rode for Cripple Creek, the rage in his heart now a cold, hard, and perfectly focused thing. He was no longer just hunting Kane. He was hunting the woman who wore Mary Lou's face. The memories were the hardest part. They came to him unbidden, in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. He would remember the way she would hum a soft tune as she mended his clothes, the way her hand would fit perfectly in his, the way her laughter could make the world seem like a brighter, more hopeful place. And then, the memory would curdle, twisted by the new, terrible truth. The humming was a lie, the touch was a betrayal, the laughter was a cruel, hollow thing. He was being haunted, not by the dead, but by the living, by the ghost of a love that had never been real. He was in a small saloon in a mining camp high in the mountains when he finally got a solid lead. He had been asking his usual, quiet questions, and his reputation, which had spread like wildfire in the wake of the Abilene shootout, had loosened the tongue of a frightened bartender. "They were here," the bartender whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Kane, the girl, and a half-dozen of his men. They were headed east, towards the Badlands. Said something about a rendezvous, about a big score down near the railhead at Santa Fe. The bartender hesitated, then leaned closer. "The girl, she ain't what she seems, mister. I saw her talking to Kane when they thought no one was watching. She was the one giving the orders. She was the one telling him how to do it." The final illusion shattered. She was not a victim. She was not a pawn. She was a player, a willing, active participant in Kane's world of violence and greed. Perhaps she had been all along. Perhaps he had just been her latest, most gullible mark. He left the saloon and rode east, into the vast, desolate expanse of the Badlands. The landscape was a perfect reflection of his own soul, barren, broken, and unforgiving. The sun beat down with a relentless, punishing heat, and the wind was a constant, mournful sigh. He was no longer just a man seeking vengeance. He was a man on a quest for an answer to a single, tormenting question: why? Why had she done it? What had driven her to such a profound, soul-destroying act of betrayal? He knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the rock formations that surrounded him, that he would not find the answer at the end of a rope, or in the bottom of a bottle. He would only find it when he looked into her eyes one last time, when he faced the ghost that had been hunting him across 1,000 miles of unforgiving territory. The trail of ghosts had led him here, to this desolate, God-forsaken place. And he knew, with a grim, unshakable finality, that it was here, in the heart of the Badlands, that the haunting would finally end. One way or another. The Badlands were a labyrinth of shadow and stone, a place where the sun baked the earth to a cracked, barren wasteland, and the wind whispered secrets through eroded canyons. It was a landscape that could swallow a man whole, a place where the unwary and the unprepared simply disappeared. For Jack, it felt like a homecoming. He was a creature of these harsh, unforgiving spaces, and he moved through them with a quiet, deadly confidence. He found the trail of Kane's gang etched in the dry, dusty earth, the tracks of a dozen horses, written hard. They were no longer trying to be subtle. They were arrogant, confident that they had left the world, and Jack Callahan, behind. It was the kind of mistake that got men like Silas Kane killed. For 2 days, Jack followed the trail, a silent, relentless predator closing in on his prey. He ate jerky and drank from his canteen, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He was no longer just a man, he was an extension of the hunt, a force of nature as patient and as deadly as the rattlesnakes that sunned themselves on the hot rocks. He found their camp at dusk on the 3rd day. It was nestled in a box canyon, a natural fortress with high, sheer walls and a single, narrow entrance. It was a classic Outlaws hideout, easily defensible, but also a perfect trap. Kane had grown complacent. He believed he was the viper in his nest, safe and untouchable. He had forgotten that there were other, more dangerous predators in the desert. Jack dismounted, leaving Diablo hidden in a cluster of rocks a half-mile from the canyon entrance. He approached the camp on foot, moving with the silent, ghostly tread that had kept him alive for so many years. He climbed the canyon wall, his fingers and boots finding purchase in the rough, weathered stone. From a ledge high above the canyon floor, he looked down on the viper's nest. There were 10 men, gathered around a crackling campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were laughing and drinking, celebrating a victory they had not yet won. And at the center of it all, sitting on a rock beside Silas Kane, was Mary Lou. She was wearing buckskins now, a gun belt strapped around her slender waist. She looked at home. There was a hardness in her eyes, a confidence in her posture, that he had never seen before. She was laughing at something Kane had said, a throaty, genuine laugh that was a dagger in Jack's heart. This was her. This was the real Mary Lou. The gentle, loving woman he had known had been a phantom, a carefully constructed illusion. Kane had his arm draped casually around her shoulders, a gesture of ownership that sent a fresh, hot wave of fury through Jack. He watched them for a long time, his mind a cold, calculating machine, assessing the layout of the camp, the positions of the guards, the patterns of their movements. He was memorizing every detail, planning the symphony of destruction he was about to unleash. He waited until the moon was high in the sky, until the whiskey had done its work, dulling their senses, slowing their reflexes. He waited until there were only 2 guards on watch, one at the canyon entrance, and one at the back of the camp, near the horses. He descended the canyon wall as silently as a spider on a thread. He took out the guard at the back first, a single, silent knife thrust that ended the man's life before he could even utter a sound. He then moved through the sleeping camp, a shadow among shadows, his Colt a cold, heavy weight in his hand. He reached the edge of the firelight, his heart a slow, steady drumbeat in his chest. Kane and Mary Lou were still awake, talking in low, intimate tones. He could hear their voices, but he couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. Their easy familiarity was a confession in itself. He stepped out of the shadows, his peacemaker leveled at Silas Kane's chest. "The party's over, Kane," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that cut through the quiet night. The camp exploded into a chaotic, panicked scramble. Men, jolted from a drunken sleep, fumbled for their guns. But they were too late, too slow. Kane reacted instantly, grabbing Mary Lou and pulling her in front of him, just as Jack had known he would. He was a coward, a snake who used others as his shield. "Callahan," he snarled, his face a mask of rage and a grudging, fearful respect. "I should have known you were too stubborn to die. You should have known better than to trust a snake," Jack said, his eyes never leaving Kane's. The guard at the front of the canyon, alerted by the commotion, began to fire, his shots wild and inaccurate in the darkness. Jack ignored him. His focus was on the man who was at the center of his pain, the man who was hiding behind the woman who had destroyed his life. "Let her go, Kane," Jack said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is between you and me." Kane laughed, a high, manic sound. "She's the reason you're here, Callahan. She's the prize. And I'm not giving her up." He pressed the barrel of his own gun to Mary Lou's temple. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she wasn't looking at Kane. She was looking at Jack. And in her eyes, he saw not a plea for help, but a cold, calculating assessment of the situation. She was not a victim. She was a player, caught in a game that had suddenly turned deadly. The other outlaws, now awake and armed, began to close in, forming a half circle around Jack. He was surrounded, outgunned, a lone man against a small army. It was an impossible situation. It was exactly where he did his best work. "Last chance, Kane," Jack said, his voice a low, final warning. Kane's answer was a sneer. "You're a dead man, Callahan." And then, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of sound and fury. Jack fired, not at Kane, but at the lantern hanging from a rock above his head. The lantern exploded, plunging the center of the camp into a sudden, disorienting darkness. In the chaos that followed, Jack became a whirlwind of motion. He fired twice, his shots guided by instinct and memory, and 2 of the outlaws fell with choked cries. He dove behind a cluster of rocks as a hail of bullets tore through the space where he had been standing. He was in his element now. The darkness was his ally, the chaos his shield. He moved from cover to cover, a deadly, invisible force, his Colt barking out its single, definitive syllable of death. He was not a man anymore. He was a legend, an avenging angel in a hell of his own making. One by one, Kane's men fell, their panicked shouts and dying screams echoing off the canyon walls. In less than a minute, it was over. The viper's nest was silent. They only sound the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged, heavy breathing of the sole survivor. Jack rose from the shadows, his gun held steady. Across the fire, Silas Kane stood alone, his human shield gone. Mary Lou had disappeared in the chaos. Kane looked at Jack, his face a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, terrible fear. He had brought the legend to his doorstep, and the legend had brought him death. It was her, Callahan, he stammered, his voice a desperate, pathetic plea. It was her idea, all of it. She came to me. She said she knew how to get to you. It doesn't matter whose idea it was, Jack said, his voice as cold and as empty as the dead bodies that littered the canyon floor. You're the one who's going to pay for it. He raised his gun, his aim steady, his heart a cold, hard stone. The reckoning had come to the viper's nest. But as he looked into the terrified eyes of his oldest enemy, he knew that this was not the end. The snake was about to die, but the ghost, the real source of his torment, was still out there, in the darkness. And the hunt was not over. Not yet. With a final, deafening roar, the legend of Silas Kane came to an end. He fell to the dusty floor of the canyon, a look of stunned surprise on his face, his life extinguished by the same force of violence he had lived by. Jack stood over him, the smoke from his colt coiling in the cool night air. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. The man who had been the focus of his rage, the physical embodiment of his quest for vengeance, was dead. But the ghost that haunted him, the real source of his pain, remained. Mary Lou was gone. In the chaotic moments of the gunfight, she had slipped away, disappearing into the darkness of the Badlands like a phantom. She had abandoned Kane to his fate, just as she had abandoned Jack to his. She was a survivor, a creature of pure, unadulterated self-interest. Jack searched the camp, his movements methodical, his mind cold and clear. He found her tracks leading to the back of the canyon, where the horses had been tethered. One of the horses was gone. She had a head start, and she was moving fast. He also found something else. In the tent she had shared with Kane, he found a small, leather-bound journal. He opened it, his hands surprisingly steady. The handwriting was hers, the same elegant, flowing script that had adorned the sketches of their imaginary home in Montana. He sat by the dying embers of the campfire and began to read. The journal was not a record of her love for him, or of her fear of Kane. It was a ledger, a cold, calculating account of her life as a con artist, a grifter who preyed on lonely, desperate men. Her real name was not Mary Lou. It was Rose. And Jack Callahan was not her first victim. He was just the latest, and the most profitable, in a long line of them. The journal detailed her methods, her successes, her failures. It was the playbook of a master manipulator, a woman who could mold herself into whatever a man wanted her to be, a ghost in the machine of human desire. Her brother, the one she had claimed Kane was holding hostage, was mentioned. He was her partner, a scout who would identify potential targets and help her set the stage for her elaborate deceptions. The final entries were about him. She had been tracking him for months, studying him, learning his weaknesses. She had known about his weariness, about his deep-seated desire for a life of peace. She had used it all against him, with a chilling, sociopathic precision. The final entry, written just the day before, was the most damning of all. Callahan is close. Kane is a fool. He thinks he controls me. But they are both just pieces in my game. Once Callahan deals with Kane, he will be wounded, emotional. That is when I will strike. I will take the money from both of them and disappear. A new life, a new name. Rose will finally be free. The world seemed to shrink around him. They are growing thin, the silence of the canyon a deafening roar. She had not just betrayed him. She had played him. She had played them all. She had been the puppet master, pulling the strings of both the gunslinger and the outlaw, setting them against each other in a bloody drama of her own creation. The rage that had fueled him for so long dissipated, replaced by something colder, something more profound. It was a feeling of utter, absolute disillusionment. The woman he had loved had never existed. He had been in love with a ghost, a phantom created for the sole purpose of his own destruction. He closed the journal, the leather cool against his skin. He now had the answer to the question that had tormented him, the question of why. The answer was simpler, and more monstrous, than he could have ever imagined. It was not for love, or for fear, or even for survival. It was for greed. It was for the thrill of the game. He knew, with a certainty that was as clear and as cold as the stars above, what he had to do. This was no longer about vengeance. Vengeance was a hot, passionate emotion, and he was beyond that now. This was about something else. This was about justice. It was about putting an end to the ghost, about stopping the machine of deceit and destruction that was Rose. He gathered what supplies he could from the camp, loaded them onto Diablo, and mounted up. He looked at the carnage around him, at the dead men who were the casualties of a game they didn't even know they were playing. He felt a flicker of something, a strange, grim kinship with his fallen enemy, Silas Kane. They had both been fools, blinded by the same beautiful, deadly illusion. He turned Diablo's head and rode out of the canyon, leaving the viper's nest to the silence and the scavengers. He was no longer a man on a trail of ghosts. He was a man hunting a ghost. And he knew where she was going. The journal had mentioned a rendezvous point, a place to meet her brother, a place to collect her winnings and disappear forever. It was a deserted, forgotten mining town on the edge of the territories, a place called Last Redemption. The irony was so thick, so bitter, it was almost poetic. It was there that the final act of this tragedy would be played out. It was there that he would face the ghost in the machine. And it was there that he would finally, irrevocably, break the last vestiges of the promise he had made to a woman who had never existed. The hunt was not for vengeance anymore. It was for an exorcism. The journey to Last Redemption was a journey through a purgatory of the soul. The landscape shifted from the rugged badlands to a flat, featureless plain, a vast, empty expanse that mirrored the hollow space in Jack's chest. The fire of his rage had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, hard ashes of a purpose that was as clear and as unforgiving as the desert sun. He rode with a grim, relentless efficiency, the journal tucked into his saddlebag, a constant, damning reminder of the truth. He was no longer the heartbroken lover or the vengeful gunslinger. He was an executioner, a man with a singular, terrible duty to perform. He was going to erase a ghost. Last Redemption was aptly named. It was a place that God, and the promise of gold, had long since abandoned. It was a skeleton of a town, its buildings bleached and weathered by the sun and the wind, their empty windows like the vacant eyes of a skull. The main street was a river of sand, the silence broken only by the mournful creak of a swinging sign and the whisper of the wind through the broken-down structures. It was a stage set for a final, tragic act. Jack arrived at dusk, the setting sun casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like tormented spirits. He dismounted at the edge of the town, his movements slow, deliberate, his senses on high alert. He could feel it in the air, a palpable tension, the feeling of being watched. She was here. He left Diablo in the relative cover of a collapsed livery stable and proceeded on foot, his boots making no sound on the soft, sandy street. He moved through the town like a wraith, a creature of the shadows, his colt a cold, familiar weight against his hip. He found her horse tied up outside the old saloon, the only building in the town that still looked remotely solid. The doors were closed, but a faint, flickering light emanated from within, a single, lonely beacon in the encroaching darkness. He didn't go in the front. He circled around to the back, his movements as silent and as fluid as a mountain lion. He found a grimy, broken window and peered inside. The saloon was a cavern of shadows, the only light coming from a single lantern placed on the bar. And in the center of the room, standing beside a table laden with saddlebags that were no doubt filled with the spoils of her deadly game, was Rose. She was not alone. A man was with her, a weary, nervous-looking man with shifty eyes and the same fine-boned features as her. Her brother. They were counting money, their heads bent together over the table, their faces illuminated by the golden glow of the lantern. "It's all here, Rose," the brother said, his voice a low, excited whisper. "Everything from Kane's score and Callahan's savings. We're rich. We're free, Leo," she corrected him, her voice holding a note of triumph that was as cold and as sharp as ice. "No more running. No more pretending. A new life in San Francisco. No one will ever find us." Jack had heard enough. He had seen enough. The quiet, domestic scene of two siblings counting their ill-gotten gains was more obscene, more damning, than any act of violence he had witnessed. He moved to the swinging doors of the saloon and pushed them open. They swung inward with a loud, groaning creak that echoed through the silent room like a death knell. Rose and her brother spun around, their faces a mixture of shock and a dawning, terrible fear. Leo's hand went for the gun on his hip, but he was too slow, too clumsy. "Don't," Jack said, his voice a low, flat sound that held the promise of a swift and certain death. Leo froze, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. Rose recovered quickly, her fear replaced by a mask of cold, defiant composure. She had underestimated him. She had believed him to be dead, or broken. But she was a gambler, and she knew how to play a bad hand. "Jack," she said, her voice a smooth, silken thing, an attempt to summon the ghost of the woman he had loved. "I knew you would come. I was hoping you would." "Were you?" he asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. He took a step into the room, the door swinging shut behind him, plunging the room into a more intimate, claustrophobic darkness. "Yes," she said, her eyes searching his, looking for a weakness, a flicker of the old love that she could exploit. "I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell you that it wasn't what it seemed." "I read your journal, Rose," he said, the name a deliberate, final rejection of the illusion she had created. "I know exactly what it was." The name hit her like a physical blow. The mask slipped, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the real woman beneath, a cornered, feral animal, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and a desperate will to survive. "Then you know why I did it," she hissed, her voice losing its silken edge, becoming hard, brittle. "This world is for the takers, Jack, not the dreamers. You and your pathetic little dream of a ranch, you were just a means to an end. A bigger, better score than any I had ever seen." "And Kane?" Jack asked, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Was he a means to an end too?" She smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression. "Kane was a fool. He thought he was using me, but I was using him. I used him to break you, and I used you to get rid of him. It was perfect." The desolate stage was set. The players were in their places. The final, terrible truth had been spoken. There was nothing left now but the inevitable, bloody conclusion. "It's over, Rose," he said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his Colt. "Is it?" she countered, her own hand moving to the gun on her hip. "I don't think so. There's one last piece of the game left to play." The moonlight began to stream through the dirty windows of the saloon, bathing the scene in a cold, silvery light. The two of them stood there, hunter and prey, lover and betrayer, their shadows long and distorted on the dusty floor. The promise of a peaceful life had led him here, to this desolate, God-forsaken stage, to a final, deadly confrontation with the woman who had been his entire world. The curtain was about to fall, and it would fall on a scene of blood and shattered promises. The silence in the saloon was a living thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from threads of betrayal, regret, and the cold, hard certainty of impending violence. The moonlight, silver and indifferent, sliced through the grime of the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny, silent witnesses. Jack and Rose stood frozen, to statues in a tableau of death, their hands hovering over their guns. Leo, her brother, was a terrified spectator, his face pale, his eyes darting between the two of them, a man who had waded into waters far too deep for him. "Get out, Leo," Rose said, her voice a low, sharp command, her eyes never leaving Jack's. "But," Rose he stammered. "Now," she snapped, the single word a whip crack in the silent room. Leo, after a moment of terrified hesitation, scrambled backwards, stumbling over a broken chair before disappearing through the swinging doors, leaving the two of them alone on the desolate stage. "He was always the weak one," Rose said, a note of contempt in her voice. It was not an apology or an explanation. It was a simple statement of fact. "And you were the strong one," Jack replied, his voice a low, flat monotone. "Strong enough to build a life on the bodies of the men you've used." "I did what I had to do to survive," she said, her voice hard, defiant. "It's a world of wolves, Jack. You, of all people, should know that. You can either be the wolf, or you can be the sheep." "I wasn't a sheep, Rose," he said, the name still ablaze in his heart. "I was a man who wanted to be a shepherd, a man who wanted to build a fence and protect what he loved." He paused, the weight of the broken promise a physical ache in his chest. "You were what I loved." For the first time, a flicker of something, an emotion he couldn't quite decipher, crossed her face. It was not remorse, not guilt. It was something closer to a pained, bitter regret. Not for what she had done to him, but for what she had become. "The girl you loved never existed, Jack," she whispered, the words a final, cruel twist of the knife. "She was a ghost. A story I told you because it was what you wanted to hear." "Then let's end the story," he said, his hand tightening on the butt of his Colt. The moment stretched, time itself seeming to slow down, to hold its breath. Every detail of the room was etched in Jack's mind with a preternatural clarity, the pattern of the bullet holes in the wall from some long-forgotten gunfight, the way the moonlight caught the edge of a broken whiskey bottle on the bar, the look in Rose's eyes, a look that was a mirror of his own, a look of profound, soul-crushing loneliness. They had been two sides of the same coin, two lonely, damaged people who had found a fleeting, illusory comfort in each other's arms. But he had wanted to be saved, and she had wanted to be the one who pulled the trigger. The decision was made, not with words, but with a subtle shift of weight, a tensing of muscles, a final, silent acknowledgement that there was no other way for this story to end. Her hand moved, a blur of practiced speed, the culmination of a life lived on the knife's edge of danger and deceit. She was fast, faster than any of Kane's men, faster than almost anyone he had ever faced. But she was an iron hand. Jack's hand was not a blur. It was a force of nature, an act of pure and thinking instinct. The cold peacemaker seemed to materialize in his hand, not as a weapon, but as a part of him, an extension of his will. The sound of his shot was a single, deafening, declarative statement, a full stop at the end of a long, bloody sentence. It was a sound that was a fraction of a second faster than hers. Her gun went off, the shot going wide, burying itself in the wooden floorboards at his feet. A look of stunned, almost childlike surprise crossed her face. She looked down at her chest, at the dark, blossoming flower of red that was spreading across the fabric of her shirt. She looked back up at him, her green eyes wide with a final, dawning understanding. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but only a soft, choked sigh escaped her lips. She crumpled to the floor, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet, final letting go, her body a puppet whose strings had been cut. The duel was over. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, a profound, deafening stillness that was broken only by the sound of Jack's own ragged breathing. He stood there, the smoke from his gun coiling around him like a vengeful spirit, and looked down at the woman who had been his dream and his damnation. He walked over to her, his boots heavy on the dusty floorboards. He knelt beside her, the hard-won victory tasting like ash in his mouth. Her eyes were still open, staring up at the ceiling, at a heaven she had never believed in. He reached out and gently closed them, his hand, the hand that had just taken her life, trembling for the first time. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in his eyes, a final, futile protest from the man he had tried to be, the man who had died in that alley in Abilene. He was not crying for her, the cold, calculating woman who had betrayed him. He was crying for the ghost, for the beautiful, loving woman who had never existed, but who he had loved with all of his broken, foolish heart. He had won. He had gotten his justice. He had silenced the ghost. But he was more alone now than he had ever been. The duel was over, but the dust of what he had lost, would never truly settle. The moonlight that had served as the stark, impartial lighting for their final act now seemed to mock him, its cold, silvery fingers tracing the outline of the woman who lay still on the saloon floor. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with the ghosts of what might have been, with the echoes of a broken promise and a love that had been a lie. Jack remained kneeling beside her for a long time, a solitary mourner at the funeral of his own soul. He had come here for a reckoning, for justice, for an end to the haunting. He had found all of those things, but he had not found peace. The hollow space within him was not filled with the satisfaction of vengeance, but with a grief so profound, so absolute. It was a physical weight, threatening to crush him. He thought of the promise he had made to her, the vow to lay down his guns, to build a life of peace. It felt like a lifetime ago, a memory from another man's life. That man was gone, buried under a mountain of betrayal and blood. What was left was this, a man with a gun in his hand and a hole in his heart, a man who had become the very thing he had tried to escape. With a heavy, weary sigh, he rose to his feet. There was one last thing to do. He couldn't leave her here, on the dusty floor of this forgotten saloon, to be found by scavengers or the indifferent hand of time. The ghost she had been deserved a better end than that. He carried her out of the saloon, her body surprisingly light in his arms, a fragile, broken thing. He took her to the edge of the desolate town, to a small, windswept hill that overlooked the vast, empty plains. There, under the silent, watchful eyes of a billion stars, he dug a grave. He worked with a grim, methodical efficiency, the shovel a far heavier burden than his gun had ever been. He laid her to rest in the cold and forgiving earth, with nothing to mark her passing but a simple cross he fashioned from the pieces of a broken fence post. He said no words. There were none left to say. As the first, faint hint of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, painting the dark sky in shades of gray and a soft, mournful pink, he walked back to the saloon. The saddlebags filled with money were still on the table, a fortune in blood and lies. He looked at it, at the price of his own soul, and felt nothing but a cold, weary revulsion. He took only one thing, the deed to the land in Montana, the brittle, folded paper that was the last, tangible remnant of his shattered dream. He left the rest, the gold and the silver, a silent, glittering monument to the price of betrayal. Let her brother have it. Let it be his curse, as it had been hers. He went to the livery stable and saddled Diablo. The powerful stallion, sensing his master's profound and spoken grief, nudged him gently with his head, a silent, comforting presence in a world that had become devoid of comfort. Jack mounted up, the worn leather of the saddle a familiar, grounding sensation. He did not look back. There was nothing left for him in last redemption, nothing left for him anywhere. He rode out of the ghost town, a solitary figure against the rising sun, a man without a destination, without a future, without a dream. He was Jack Iron Hand Callahan again, the legend, the gunslinger. But the name no longer held any pride, any power. It was just a label, a brand on a man who was already dead inside. He carried with him the weight of his final, broken promise, a vow of peace that had been paid for in blood. Mary Lou, or Rose, or whatever her name had been, was a testament to the terrible price of betrayal. But he, Jack Callahan, was a testament to something else, something far more tragic, the cost of believing in a promise that was never meant to be kept. As he rode into the vast, empty wilderness, the only thing he knew for certain was that the gunslinger had a new ghost to add to his collection, a green-eyed specter who would ride with him forever. A constant, silent reminder of the love that had almost saved him, and the betrayal that had damned him for all time. The dust was behind him, but the story, his story, would forever be one of blood and a broken vow.